they're getting away with it after a year, half a year of a little bit tougher times. And this is the treaty context in which the ends are being formed. So, I mean, to boil the frog is the popular metaphor to explain I mean, if you put a frog in a boiling pot, he will jump out. But if you do it slowly and slowly and slowly, he will stay there and he will die. And that's exactly what happened in Ukraine. You see the very, very slow escalation, very, very sensitive to Western decision-making processes, and even more interestingly, very sensitive to the Western attention spans. We're being run by policy cycles are 1 week, 2 weeks. So if Russia makes little advances in the agenda for a few days, then something happens in Gaza, then something happens in Syria, then something happens elsewhere. And when the attention cycle is moving away, the escalation continues. So, but if saying that there's no ends is not very helpful, I think there's a juggle where a few different perspectives need to be put into this. I mean, one is the great power perspective. This is also ties in with the confrontation to the West. I mean, the status and the freedom of maneuver in the near abroad is key for Russia, and the way that is understood is a competition against the West. Eastern Partnership, 2 out of 6 countries in the Eastern Partnership has now been invaded. Georgia, Ukraine. That's a non-military takeover. The domestic issue is one of the one I like to talk the most about normally, so I'm not going to do it now. That will be, I would say, the ends. Just to give a short, I haven't focused on geographical areas, what might be the next step, but I think there's a few that might be lifted, and I think one you didn't mention is Moldova. I mean, the political instability there is vast. You have still, I think, people out in the square, and you have the Russian party back in, and the pro-Russian oligarch might be able to. Well, re-elections are coming up, but the Moldovan constitution prohibits them from being so short, so they have to wait another few months, and after that you might have the pro-Russian party go in there. I would say Central Asian integration, as we said, you look in Central Asia, Russia is not the biggest trading partner to any of the countries. It's the EU and Kazakhstan, and I think the rest one is China. But the Eurasian Economic Union is going forward as well. Russia is compensating its soft power weakness with hard power threats, bribes, and sweet deals. And this is a way, geopolitical move, to fence out China and to grow, I would say. I will end there and leave the rest for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Oscar. Now, the best questions of this conference has been posed by you, the audience, but while I still have the chance, I want to ask a question myself. We've been discussing hybrid. I know that you, Oscar, you don't like the term hybrid, but let's call it that, or potential conflict. And you, Anders, you mentioned a couple of criteria that should be fulfilled in order for a hybrid conflict to be possible. Still, there has been a lot of talk amongst experts, policymakers, that the Nordic-Baltic region might be next up, especially the Baltic countries, for Russian aggression. And what we tend to have in mind then is a hybrid conflict. So I would like all of you in the panel to comment on this. What do you think the possibility is for Russia to actually try to do something more here? More than information warfare, more than aggressive overflights, underwater intrusions. I mean, a full-scale hybrid conflict. Who wants to start?
Okay. Yeah, well, I can go first. I'd say, I think one has to analyze the strategic goal, and I think that's the important thing, because if you would say that, let's just assume that keeping Sweden out of NATO is the key goal. Well, I think the last thing you would do would be to start shooting in Sweden. However, when it comes to hybrid and non-military means, I think one of the anti-NATO side, one of the strongest argument is, or strongest, but one of the most frequent argument for them is joining NATO would increase the level of tensions. So then it's critical important to make the normal level scenes as full of tension. Because if that would raise the level of tension, I mean, that's why you need to make it look as much. But that the anti-NATO you would do by then, the submarine plane violations, but also political influence operations. That's where I would focus all my energy if that was my key goal. But I wouldn't, I don't think it's highly likely, but I wouldn't exclude anything just because strategy, interdependent process, a standoff might escalate. Anything might happen. And when a standoff escalates, if you back down, you will look weak.
Anders, you're still
Okay.
writing. Do you want to comment now? Or?
I can, or I can be wrong. I mean, I love playing a Russian military planner. The problem is I'm not paid that well for that. There is it's very important to make a differentiation. You speaking about the united Nordic-Baltic region, I think here is wrong, because there is a fundamental difference whether the given country is member of NATO or not. And who knows NATO the best? The Russians. The whole military elite has been built up and socialized against the NATO. They've been studying the alliance ever since 1949. They know a lot about NATO. And I very much support what Robert said. We have to be self-confident. I mean, I'm a historian by education. NATO is the strongest military alliance ever existed in human history. Just taste this thing. It's not the Roman Empire. That time China knew nothing about the Roman Empire. It's the NATO. And Russians know it very well. My point here is that I think as long as the Russian decision maker remains rational, which will remain rational except the real Skyfall scenario, they will never risk testing Article 5. Imagine if I'm an advisor of Mr. Putin. What advice can I give? Sir, we can test NATO Article 5. If they fail, we can get the Baltic states. But if Article 5 functions, sir, we all perish. They will not risk that. They are rational. They know us very well and they know their own weaknesses. If you read their military literature, they're counting in hours how long it would take their whole armed forces to get destroyed and rendered dysfunctional. They are preparing for the defense of Moscow because St. Petersburg for them is undefendable. They would never attack, they would never risk, in my opinion, provoking an Article 5 answer. Anything below Article 5, that's for sure, including even kidnappings, which was a really, really nasty case. And we shall not forget about Ashton Kochver, because this was one of the nastiest cases they've been done. Not mocking attacks, not airspace violations, but kidnapping a security officer of a NATO country. This is really dirty. And they are capable of doing that. And they basically got away with that. I cannot exclude that they would, and they are able and they are willing to repeat that. But they will not test Article 5. Those countries which are not member of NATO, and myself not being from those countries, I'm a Hungarian working in Finland for not that long, I try to refrain commenting regional security politics because I don't know much about that. But I don't see the interest for them in a military attack. I would very much go for what Oscar said. Political influence operations, destabilization, all that. And the thing they could done parallelly is to try to get anti-Western parties on power. Not only in the Nordic-Baltic region, but anywhere else in the EU/in the NATO. If in a single NATO country you can manage to get an anti-NATO party on power, for example, Jobbik in Hungary, you can disable whole NATO because nobody can be kicked out of NATO. Imagine if there is a country which is able to block NATO decision-making or significantly slow it down, because it would take some time for you to realize that something is seriously wrong. And if you can do it in more than 2 countries, then it further weakens the alliance. The same goes for the EU. So I support what Oscar said. They are going to focus on political influence operations with all the tools and means they would have, and there we have a comment.
Well, I mean, first of all, this made me think this vision of NATO as a Roman Empire. I mean, I think the North Atlantic Council meetings will look a bit different.
Yes.
And don't mention the thing. Anyway, but seriously, yes, I agree. I mean, yes, political influence, that's obvious and it's happening. But, first of all, do they really understand NATO that well? And frankly speaking, our world? I'm not sure. The people who have done biggest damage to Russia are those who define threats. that do the threat analysis, because they minds, and this is a mixture of, well, essentially, us, they have this Hobbesian vision of the world, which is, pretty nasty, and, they're thinking of some Third World War in, 10 years' time, and they see threats everywhere, and of course the Color Revolution. The problem is, I know it's an anecdote, but in my view, illustrates well. Rogozin was ambassador to NATO. He was saying goodbye. Before leaving, he wanted to plant a poplar, right? Yuri knows the story. Poplar. There's quite a few trees in NATO HQ command. We're going to try to be ecological as well. But he was refused. And he was absolutely livid about it. And he said, it's NATO, they refuse, silly, against me, etc. And I reasoned with him. I said, look, you don't understand. First of all, you blame SecGen and the North Atlantic Council. The decision was taken by the gardener. The gardener! I said, yeah, because decisions of that nature are taken in NATO by a gardener. Really? Why didn't he agree to the poplar? I said, well, because he thinks poplars are rubbish trees, If you suggested an oak, he would have said yes. But, the joke is poplar, topol, get it, I planted topol. I said, well, but, you have to understand, our gardener, he doesn't really give a toss about, international politics and your jokes, He has a different sense of humor. He's a straightforward Belgian guy who just likes to have a few beer and so on. So, and after all, 4 years in NATO, you didn't understand that? Who takes decision on planting trees? So, I'll be very, very careful in sort of, ascribing too much knowledge and so on. But having said this, it's true that, hybrid warfare, I know, hybrid warfare, Thucydides and all that, but at the time of Thucydides, there was no Russia Today or Gazprom, Times have changed a bit. The problem with hybrid warfare, and you can call it Marianne if you want, is that by the time you can even give it a name, it's already been going on for a long time. When we see the Green Man, that was phase 3 of the operation. You see what I mean? So in other words, we're back to the same thing, confidence. And by the way, I think if there were some big, big, big problems, we're learning as well. NATO, EU is learning. One thing, the people in charge in the Kremlin have done is they have been extremely helpful in, nudging us towards greater cooperation between, for instance, NATO and partners, also NATO, European Union. Because we know if you want to deal with hybrid warfare, only some of them, you're absolutely right, are military. The rest, that's not NATO's dossier. But we're getting, I think, much better than that, and we actually are doing this right now. So in that sense, I'm quite optimistic. But it won't go away by itself. These people will not stop. The comfort zone, you can forget about. If you're looking for a comfort zone, it does not exist anymore, because that's part of the objective, is not to have a comfort zone. But if you accept the fact, one can live with that. It makes life perhaps more stimulating, but it's, you stay closer to reality. Mr. Putin will take you out of your comfort zone. But if you tell them, we have every chance of winning for the benefit of us, but also of Russia itself. Because in the end of the day, Russian people do not want a conflict. And all the opinion polls still show that.
Thank you very much. With that, I open up the floor to questions. And Mike was the first one raising his hand. Let's wait for a microphone.
Thank you. Mike Halsell, Johns Hopkins and Finnish Institute of International Affairs. First of all, I almost never disagree with my colleague Andras, but I have to on the idea. Sure, it would be a disaster politically if Jobbik would take over the government in Hungary or some other undemocratic government would take over a NATO country, but we have precedent for this. The Greek colonels from 67 to 73 were frozen out. They couldn't disrupt the consensus in NATO. And there was another one, which is a real footnote to history. In the summer of 1975, when it looked like the communists might take over Portugal, they were similarly excluded from the decision-making mechanism in NATO. So I'm really not concerned about that. It would obviously be terrible if Jobbik would take over Hungary. I'd like to bring up an issue, though, which we haven't really talked about much, if at all, which is, at least until recently, a big issue, at least in the United States, and that's namely supplying defensive lethal weaponry to Ukraine. I realize there's a lull now in the fighting for tactical reasons in all likelihood. My question would be the following. Do we have confidence enough in the loyalty of the Ukrainian military? Do we know the units that are legitimate, that are run by patriots? Do we think that there would be, let's talk about Javelin anti-tank missiles as an example. Do we think that if the United States should change its mind and decide to furnish them to, if they could find if they were convinced that the units could be identified, as I just said, in the Ukrainian army, how badly would this fracture the unity in NATO, Robert, that you talked about as the chief achievement? What is the status basically right now of supplying lethal defensive weaponry to Ukraine?
Thank you, Mike. I think we'll take 2 more questions at the same time. First it's Stefan, then it's Polly.
Stefan Olsson, I'm a freelance writer. My question is that I don't believe that Vladimir Putin has an end state in mind, that rather he's making up things making things up along the way. So would you agree? Does he have an end state in mind?
Thank you, and we'll take Polly at the same time.
Thank you very much, Katarina. And Pauli Järvenpää is my name. I'm a former Finnish defense official, 30 plus years. And now I am a researcher or senior researcher at the ICDS in Tallinn. When I have been listening to these very good speeches and remarks, I have been reminded of my grandpa's joke. And I have to tell you that it is a joke because some people don't understand this Finno-Ugric humor, perhaps. He was saying that, I don't understand why people are saying that you can't trust the Russians. Of course you can trust the Russians. I trust the Russians when the wooden cross on their grave has been rotted away. So you see what Finnish humor is like. But I do have a question to all of you, and it actually, I don't know what it says about Michael Halsell, but at least we seem to be thinking along the same lines. Now there is a lull in Ukraine. And lots of thinking, I hope, in NATO is going to the question of what to do after the lull is over. What are your thoughts and recipes of how to go along when, if and when, I would imagine when, the Russian leadership will put more heat on the Ukrainians?
Thank you. I'll let the panel answer the 3 questions. 2 questions about Ukraine and 1 about the end game of Mr. Putin. Feel free to answer them all or just one of them.
I mean, Ukraine, I have to start with sort of official, bureaucratic, if you like, point, because obviously NATO does not possess any arms, so you cannot even speak of the sort of policy because NATO cannot decide. We possess some AWACS planes and a couple of some transport planes. Even that is actually some nations. But NATO has a policy of obviously supporting the Minsk process because we believe however imperfect it may be, there is nothing better on the market, so to speak. And after all, Ukrainians accept it. So having said this, Ukraine is not any sort of blacklist of countries covered by the United Nations. It has every right to buy or to receive as a donation equipment, and there's no distinction made between lethal and non-lethal. So it really is up to the country, but of course they have to weigh some political consequences. And you know, the questions that you raised are valid ones. I don't have the answer to them, or if I have some answers, I could not share them perhaps in public. But the truth is that Ukraine both deserves and Ukraine is receiving assistance. You know, we do it slightly different ways. We don't have people, of course, who fight, for sure, because we don't have any operational role, but we do advise. We do really help Ukraine with reforms, and it's not. It's an important matter because we are helping Ukraine to be better able to defend itself. And you know, I'm not saying it's because of us. We played a certain role, but Ukrainians themselves. However, we know all the problems they're facing, and you know, things are far from ideal. But the truth of the matter is, and that's clearly recognized by the Russians, they have proven to be much better in withstanding a lot of pressure. And frankly speaking, if the separatists were not receiving this support, which is still permanent, you know, politically there may be problems. You know, even the recent change of Mr. Surkov. How do we know that Mr. Surkov is no longer the curator of the Novorossiya project? It's Mr. Kozak now, because the separatists themselves are an answer to the whole world. You know. In other words, there were various reasons why you know, there is not so much pressure. Why the Russian TV stopped talking about Ukraine on every sort of, you know, thing. So Ukrainians are dealing with the problems better. They are more efficient, and we will continue to help them in terms of forms. What do we do? Well, first the Minsk process. It's, you know, it may be prolonged because all the conditions. You know,